The strongest people in a prison are rarely the ones who make the most noise. The afternoon count had just ended when the heavy steel doors echoed through the corridor of Riverside State Prison, sending a familiar silence across cell block D. Every inmate knew the routine. Walk in line. Keep your eyes forward. Never give the bullies a reason to notice you. But routines had a way of breaking the moment someone new arrived. Elijah Brooks walked with slow, measured steps, his orange uniform hanging loosely from his lean frame. At 71 years old, the elderly black inmate looked completely out of place among men half his age. His gray hair was neatly trimmed. Deep lines marked his weathered face, yet there was no fear in his expression. He carried a small paper bag containing everything the prison allowed him to own. No photographs, no letters, no complaints, just quiet dignity. That alone was enough to draw attention. From the second-floor railing, Derek Cole leaned forward with a grin that had become famous throughout the prison. Tall, broad-shouldered, and surrounded by a loyal circle of white inmates, Derek ruled Block D without needing an official title. People moved when he walked. Conversations stopped when he spoke. For years, intimidation had become the unofficial language of the corridor, and everyone understood it. Everyone except the old man, who continued walking as though none of it existed. Derek exchanged amused glances with his friends before slowly stepping into the middle of the hallway. One by one, the others followed, forming a human wall that forced Elijah to stop. Around them, dozens of inmates suddenly found reasons to pay attention without appearing obvious. Some folded their arms. Others lowered their eyes. Experienced prisoners recognized the beginning of another public humiliation. New arrivals almost always became entertainment. Derek looked Elijah up and down before letting out a quiet laugh. You take a wrong turn on your way to a retirement home, old man? A few chuckles echoed through the corridor. Elijah simply looked at him with calm, steady eyes, saying nothing. The silence seemed to irritate Derek more than any insult could have. He took one casual step closer, invading the old man's space, expecting hesitation, fear, or at least nervousness. None came. Elijah's breathing remained slow and even. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His hands rested naturally at his sides, revealing thick calluses across his knuckles that no one bothered to notice. Derek smirked before giving the elderly inmate a careless shove meant more to embarrass than to injure. Elijah lost his balance and stumbled onto one knee against the cold concrete floor. A wave of laughter rolled through the corridor. Several inmates shook their heads, convinced they had just witnessed another helpless victim becoming part of Derek's growing reputation. But while everyone focused on the old man kneeling quietly beneath the fluorescent lights, no one noticed the prison counselor, standing at the far end of the hallway, suddenly freeze after reading a single line from Elijah Brooks' transfer file. The laughter gradually faded, but the strange silence that replaced it felt even heavier. Elijah Brooks slowly rose to his feet without a single complaint. He brushed a thin layer of dust from his prison uniform with careful movements that seemed almost practiced. His breathing never changed. His expression remained calm, as though the entire incident had been nothing more than an unexpected delay in an ordinary afternoon. Derek Cole watched him closely, waiting for anger, embarrassment, or at least a sharp remark that would give him another excuse to keep the crowd entertained. Instead, the elderly inmate simply nodded once, picked up his paper bag from the floor, and continued walking toward the intake officer. That quiet response confused more people than any confrontation ever could. From the opposite end of the corridor, prison counselor Emily Carter lowered the transfer folder in her hands and read the highlighted sentence one more time to make sure her eyes had not betrayed her. Elijah Brooks, age 71, former state karate champion, certified instructor, recipient of multiple civilian commendations for youth mentorship. She blinked in disbelief. Nothing about the gentle old man walking away suggested decades of disciplined martial arts training. She glanced toward Officer Daniel Harris, who had witnessed the entire exchange without intervening because no prison rule had technically been broken. Quietly, she held out the file. Harris scanned the first page, then stopped on the same line that had frozen Emily moments earlier. His eyes lifted toward Elijah with a completely different expression. Respect had replaced routine observation. Derek and the other inmates never noticed the exchange. They were too busy congratulating themselves over what they believed had been another effortless display of dominance. Inside Block D, reputation was everything, and public humiliation was the currency that kept the unofficial hierarchy alive. Every new inmate eventually learned that lesson. Yet something about this one felt unusually incomplete. Marcus Reed, Elijah's assigned cellmate, had watched everything from several yards away. Unlike the others, he had spent enough years inside Riverside State Prison to recognize details that newcomers ignored. He noticed the old man's balanced posture when he stood back up. He noticed the controlled rhythm of his breathing. Most of all, he noticed Elijah never looked at the floor after stumbling. His eyes stayed level, quietly observing every face, every exit, every movement around him without appearing nervous. Marcus had seen that kind of awareness only a handful of times before, usually in military veterans or experienced instructors who never allowed panic to control their decisions. As evening approached, the housing unit settled into its familiar rhythm. Metal doors echoed. Dinner carts rolled across polished concrete. Conversations drifted between cells beneath the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Elijah carefully arranged his few belongings on the small metal shelf beside his bunk with remarkable precision before sitting down to read the prison handbook that most inmates ignored. Across the room, Marcus finally broke the silence. He studied the elderly man for several long seconds before asking the question that had been lingering in his mind ever since the corridor. How did you stay that calm when everyone expected you to lose your temper? Elijah slowly closed the booklet, looked toward the narrow window where the last rays of daylight stretched across the concrete wall, and answered with a peaceful smile. Because the strongest response is not always the first one people expect. The following morning began long before sunrise, when the harsh buzz of the prison intercom echoed through Block D, and another day inside Riverside State Prison officially came to life. Metal doors unlocked one after another with familiar mechanical clicks, and hundreds of footsteps blended into a steady rhythm as inmates prepared for breakfast. Elijah Brooks folded his blanket with careful precision before making his bed so neatly that even Marcus Reed paused to watch. Every movement carried the quiet discipline of someone who had repeated the same habits for decades. There was no rush, no wasted motion, and no sign that the events of the previous afternoon had unsettled him in the slightest. Marcus found himself becoming increasingly curious. Most new inmates spent their first morning looking exhausted or anxious. Elijah appeared as though he had awakened in the comfort of his own home. As they joined the breakfast line, whispers traveled faster than the trays sliding across the serving counter. Derek Cole and his group had already spread the story of the old man falling in the corridor, turning it into another tale that reinforced their reputation. Some inmates laughed when Elijah passed. Others quietly observed him, waiting to see whether yesterday had been an isolated incident or merely the beginning of something larger. Elijah acknowledged none of it. He accepted his breakfast with a polite thank you, balanced the tray effortlessly, and searched for an empty table near the windows where the morning sunlight reached across the room. Marcus followed, noticing once again how naturally the older man seemed to scan every doorway without appearing suspicious. It looked less like fear and more like lifelong awareness. Across the cafeteria, Officer Daniel Harris remained unusually attentive. The transfer file had stayed on his desk all night, and curiosity had led him to read far beyond the first page. The records described local tournaments, youth outreach programs, volunteer coaching, and years spent teaching discipline instead of competition. There was almost nothing about aggression. In fact, every recommendation praised Elijah for avoiding conflict whenever possible. Harris found himself wondering what kind of circumstances could bring a man with that history into a maximum security prison. The answer was locked inside sealed legal documents that even he could not access. Derek eventually noticed where Elijah had chosen to sit. Instead of approaching immediately, he leaned back in his chair with quiet confidence, smiling as though he had already planned the rest of the week. Men like him preferred patience because anticipation often unsettled people more than direct confrontation. Several members of his group laughed as they exchanged ideas about harmless pranks designed to embarrass the quiet newcomer. None of them realized that the attention they were giving Elijah only made the surrounding inmates more interested in watching every interaction. Without intending to, Derek had turned the elderly man into the center of the entire housing unit. Elijah quietly finished his meal, placed every utensil neatly onto the tray, and stood to return it. As he walked away, Marcus finally noticed something he had missed before. Wrapped carefully around Elijah's left wrist was a faded cloth bracelet with tiny embroidered letters that read, "Strength begins with patience." The words were simple, but for reasons Marcus could not explain, they stayed in his mind long after the old man disappeared into the morning crowd. By late afternoon, Block D had settled into the predictable rhythm that every long-term inmate understood. The sharp echoes of closing cell doors gave way to distant conversations, rolling laundry carts, and the occasional whistle from correctional officers changing shifts. For most people inside Riverside State Prison, every day blended into the next until time itself seemed to lose meaning. Elijah Brooks, however, treated every hour as though it still carried purpose. After returning from his assigned maintenance duty, he quietly wiped down the small metal table inside his cell before neatly folding the towel he had been given. Marcus Reed watched with growing fascination. Nothing Elijah did appeared accidental. Every movement seemed deliberate, calm, and almost ceremonial. It reminded Marcus of watching an experienced craftsman rather than an inmate serving a sentence. During recreation hour, while dozens of inmates gathered around weight benches, card tables, and basketball courts, Elijah chose the far corner of the yard beneath an aging oak tree. He stood facing the afternoon breeze with his eyes gently closed for several moments before beginning slow stretches that looked more like peaceful breathing exercises than physical training. His hands moved with smooth precision. His posture remained perfectly balanced, and each motion flowed naturally into the next without hurry or strain. Several inmates laughed quietly, assuming the elderly man was simply trying to loosen stiff joints. Others barely noticed him. Marcus did. There was something unusual about the way Elijah shifted his weight without ever seeming unstable. Even on uneven ground, his feet settled naturally into positions that looked effortless yet remarkably secure. Nearby, Officer Daniel Harris observed from the perimeter walkway. He had spent nearly 15 years working corrections and had seen athletes, military veterans, former law enforcement officers, and professional fighters pass through the prison system. The old man's movements did not resemble exercise designed to impress anyone. They reflected habits that had become part of daily life after decades of repetition. Harris quietly recalled the transfer file and found himself wondering how many years it would take to move with that level of control. Meanwhile, Derek Cole noticed something entirely different. From across the recreation yard, he saw several inmates glancing toward Elijah instead of paying attention to him. It was only a handful of people, but inside Block D, attention meant influence, and influence was something Derek guarded carefully. He did not understand why anyone would find an elderly inmate interesting, yet curiosity itself bothered him. He casually called two members of his group together and nodded toward the oak tree. They exchanged amused smiles before agreeing that the quiet newcomer needed another reminder about who controlled the housing unit. None of them considered the possibility that patience could be mistaken for weakness. As recreation hour came to an end, Elijah slowly opened his eyes and looked toward the fading sunlight stretching across the prison yard. He smiled gently, almost as though he had remembered a distant chapter of his life that no one else could see. Marcus approached as they began walking back toward the housing unit. After several moments of silence, he finally asked, "Did someone teach you to stay that calm, or were you always like this?" Elijah looked ahead without slowing his pace. His voice remained soft, yet every word carried quiet certainty. A good teacher shows you how to win. A great teacher shows you when winning no longer matters. Marcus had expected an answer. He had not expected a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of the day. Dawn arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds, and the cooler air drifting through the narrow prison windows made the concrete walls feel even colder than usual. Another ordinary day began inside Riverside State Prison, but beneath the routine, quiet expectations had already started to grow. Word traveled quickly inside any correctional facility, and although Elijah Brooks had spoken very little since his arrival, people had begun talking about him more than he realized. Some believed he was simply an unusually calm old man. Others wondered whether his silence concealed something much deeper. Derek Cole refused to believe there was any mystery at all. In his mind, respect was earned by making other people hesitate, and Elijah had not yet learned that lesson. As inmates gathered for their morning work assignments, Derek stood near the equipment room surrounded by the same group that had followed him for years. They laughed easily, exchanged stories, and greeted passing inmates with the effortless confidence of men who believed nothing inside these walls could ever challenge their position. Derek noticed several people looking past him toward Elijah, as the elderly man collected a broom and dustpan for another maintenance shift. The brief glances irritated him far more than he wanted to admit. Attention was something he had spent years controlling, and now an elderly black inmate who barely spoke had somehow become the subject of quiet conversations throughout the housing unit. Marcus Reed sensed the growing tension immediately. Walking beside Elijah, he lowered his voice and said, "Some people do not like unanswered questions. The more you ignore them, the more determined they become." Elijah simply smiled as though he had heard the same warning many times before. "People often chase answers," he replied softly. "Wisdom comes from deciding which questions deserve one." Marcus shook his head with a faint laugh. Every conversation with the older man somehow felt less like ordinary prison talk and more like listening to a teacher who had spent a lifetime studying people instead of judging them. Throughout the morning, Elijah completed every assignment with remarkable care. He greeted correctional staff politely, helped another elderly inmate lift a heavy supply box without drawing attention to himself, and returned borrowed tools exactly where they belonged. Officer Daniel Harris watched the interactions from a distance and noticed something unexpected. Employees who normally exchanged only brief instructions with inmates found themselves speaking respectfully with Elijah after only a few minutes. It was not because he demanded respect. Somehow, his quiet courtesy invited it naturally. Derek noticed that as well, and the realization unsettled him. He quietly gathered 2 members of his group before the lunch bell sounded. "This ends today," he said with a confident smile. "Everybody keeps staring at him like he is somebody special. By this afternoon, they will remember exactly who runs this block." None of them questioned the plan because they had learned long ago to trust Derek's confidence. Yet from across the corridor, Elijah paused for only a brief moment, as though he had sensed several eyes following him. He adjusted the faded bracelet around his wrist, took one slow breath, and continued walking with the same peaceful expression, completely unaware that another carefully planned test of his patience was already beginning to unfold. The lunch bell echoed through Riverside State Prison with its familiar metallic ring, drawing inmates from every work detail toward the main dining hall. Conversations filled the corridors, trays rattled against stainless steel counters, and the ordinary sounds of another prison afternoon masked the quiet tension that had been building since sunrise. Elijah Brooks joined the line without rushing, waiting patiently as each inmate received a standard meal. He thanked the kitchen worker with the same gentle courtesy he had shown everyone since arriving, then carried his tray toward the same table near the windows. Marcus Reed followed close behind, noticing several heads quietly turn in their direction. Something in the atmosphere felt different. People were not simply watching anymore. They were waiting. Across the room, Derek Cole exchanged a confident glance with 2 members of his group before standing from his seat. He moved slowly through the cafeteria, smiling as though he had all the time in the world. The conversations around him gradually became quieter. Experienced inmates recognized the pattern. Whenever Derek crossed the room with that expression, someone usually became the center of unwanted attention. Marcus leaned closer to Elijah and spoke under his breath. "You can still choose another table." Elijah looked at him with the same peaceful smile that never seemed to disappear. "Changing tables does not always change hearts," he answered softly. Before Marcus could respond, Derek arrived beside them. He rested one hand on the back of the empty chair across from Elijah and looked down with a smile that carried more confidence than kindness. "You have become pretty popular for someone who barely says a word," he remarked. Elijah calmly set his plastic cup beside his tray before meeting Derek's eyes. "Sometimes people are simply curious," he replied. Derek chuckled, expecting nervousness that never came. "Curiosity usually gets people into trouble around here." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "It can also help them discover the truth." The answer caught Derek slightly off guard. There was no challenge in the old man's voice, no sarcasm, no anger. It sounded like an ordinary observation, and somehow that unsettled him more than an argument would have. Around them, dozens of inmates pretended to focus on their meals while quietly listening to every word. Officer Daniel Harris watched from the opposite side of the cafeteria, sensing that the conversation balanced on an invisible edge. He remained alert without stepping closer. Prison rules allowed conversation, and nothing threatening had occurred. Yet Harris remembered every page of Elijah's transfer file and could not ignore the growing feeling that everyone inside the room was misunderstanding the quiet man sitting by the window. Derek finally leaned forward with a confident grin. "You know, people keep saying there is something different about you. I do not see it." Elijah folded his hands together and answered with complete sincerity. "That is because you are looking for strength in the wrong places." The table fell silent. Even Marcus stopped breathing for a brief moment. Derek stared at the elderly man, searching for mockery that simply was not there. Instead, he found calm eyes filled with quiet certainty. As the lunch period ended and inmates began returning their trays, whispers spread through the cafeteria faster than before. For the first time since Elijah arrived at Riverside, people were no longer talking about an old inmate who refused to react. They were beginning to wonder whether the quietest man inside Block D understood something the rest of them had not yet learned. The final recreation period of the day usually gave the inmates a brief chance to escape the endless routine of concrete walls and locked doors. But that afternoon, an unusual stillness settled over the yard. Small groups gathered near the basketball court. Others walked slow circles along the perimeter, while a handful simply stood watching without admitting what had captured their attention. Elijah Brooks was sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench beneath the same old oak tree, quietly repairing the loose stitching on his prison-issued work glove. With a small plastic sewing tool from the maintenance shop, his hands moved steadily, every stitch placed with remarkable care. Marcus Reed approached carrying 2 paper cups of water and sat beside him without speaking for a moment. Finally he sighed. "You know they are not going to leave you alone." Elijah accepted the cup with a grateful smile. "Sometimes people keep knocking because they expect a different answer every time," he said. "That does not mean you have to open the door." Marcus looked toward the far side of the yard where Derek Cole and several members of his group had gathered. Their conversation appeared casual, but their eyes repeatedly drifted toward the old man beneath the tree. "This feels different," Marcus admitted quietly. "He does not like that people are talking about you instead of him." Elijah took a slow sip of water before answering. "Respect that depends on fear disappears the moment fear does." Marcus considered those words in silence. Before he could respond, raised voices echoed from the basketball court. A younger inmate had accidentally bumped into one of Derek's friends while chasing a loose ball. The mistake lasted only a second, yet the young man immediately apologized and stepped back. Even from a distance, his nervous expression was obvious. Several inmates instinctively turned away, unwilling to become involved. Elijah watched the scene without moving. His eyes remained calm, but Marcus noticed something different this time. The peaceful smile had faded. In its place was quiet concern. The younger inmate continued apologizing, clearly hoping the misunderstanding would end there. Derek slowly walked toward the scene with measured confidence, enjoying the attention that naturally followed him. Officer Daniel Harris had already started across the yard from the opposite direction, but he was still several yards away. Marcus glanced at Elijah. "Do not do anything," he whispered. "You have stayed out of trouble this long." Elijah remained seated for another heartbeat, his gaze fixed on the frightened young inmate, who stood completely alone while everyone else pretended not to notice. Then he carefully placed the repaired glove beside him and stood with the same deliberate composure he had shown since arriving at Riverside. There was no anger in his face, no urgency in his stride, only quiet resolve. Marcus felt his stomach tighten because he suddenly understood that this was no longer about protecting pride or avoiding attention. It was about protecting someone else's dignity. Around the yard, conversations slowly faded as more inmates noticed the elderly man calmly walking toward the center of the unfolding confrontation. For the first time since entering Block D, Elijah Brooks was not walking away from trouble. He was walking directly toward it, and no one watching could guess how that single decision was about to change everything. Every conversation in the recreation yard disappeared into silence as Elijah Brooks stopped a few feet away from the frightened young inmate. The younger man lowered his eyes, clearly expecting another humiliating moment in front of everyone watching. Derek Cole folded his arms with an amused smile, almost entertained by the sight of the elderly newcomer stepping into a situation that no one else had dared interrupt. Around them, inmates quietly drifted closer without appearing obvious. Even those pretending to continue their basketball game slowed their movements. Something about Elijah's calm approach made it impossible to look away. Officer Daniel Harris continued walking toward the gathering crowd, his attention fixed entirely on the old man whose transfer file had remained in his thoughts for days. Elijah looked first at the younger inmate and offered a reassuring smile. "It is all right," he said gently. "Everyone makes mistakes." His voice carried no fear, no challenge, only kindness. Then he turned toward Derek. "He has already apologized. There is no reason for this to become anything more." Derek laughed softly and shook his head. "You really think you can tell me how things work around here?" Elijah answered without hesitation. "No, I am only asking whether respect can begin where pride decides to end." Several inmates exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected shouting, insults, or threats. Instead, they found themselves listening to a conversation that sounded more like two people discussing life than arguing inside a maximum security prison. Derek took another step closer, searching Elijah's face for the slightest sign of uncertainty. There was none. The old man's breathing remained slow and even. His posture stayed perfectly balanced, his shoulders relaxed, his hands resting naturally at his sides. Harris recognized the familiar composure immediately. It matched every description contained inside Elijah's training history. Before anyone could speak again, the younger inmate quietly lost his footing while stepping backward on uneven pavement. Instinctively, Elijah moved with remarkable speed. His hand gently steadied the young man by the shoulder before he could stumble any farther, then just as smoothly helped him regain his balance. The movement lasted less than a second. It looked effortless, almost invisible, yet every experienced observer noticed the extraordinary precision behind it. There was no wasted motion, no panic, only perfect timing and complete control. Marcus Reed stared in disbelief. Derek's confident smile slowly disappeared. Officer Harris stopped walking altogether. He had just witnessed the same level of disciplined coordination described throughout Elijah's record, displayed not to overpower someone, but simply to prevent an unnecessary fall. The younger inmate quietly whispered, "Thank you, sir," before stepping aside. For several long moments, no one said a word. The silence itself became the loudest sound in the yard. Derek looked at Elijah differently now, not with admiration, but with growing uncertainty. Questions he had dismissed only hours earlier suddenly returned with uncomfortable force. Who was this quiet, elderly man who moved with such effortless precision while refusing every opportunity to intimidate anyone? As the afternoon sun settled lower across the prison yard, Counselor Emily Carter emerged from the administration building carrying the same transfer folder she had read on Elijah's first day. She paused after noticing the crowd, opened the file once more, and quietly read the highlighted line aloud to herself. 3-time state karate champion and certified instructor. For the first time, the truth was no longer hidden in paperwork alone. It had revealed itself in a single peaceful moment that everyone present would remember. By the time the recreation period ended, the atmosphere inside Block D had changed in a way that no official report could ever explain. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had raised a fist. No alarms had sounded. Yet every inmate who had witnessed the quiet exchange beneath the old oak tree walked back toward the housing unit, carrying the same unanswered question. How could someone possess that level of confidence without ever trying to prove it? Elijah Brooks returned to his cell at the same unhurried pace as always, carrying nothing except his folded work gloves. Marcus Reed walked beside him in complete silence until they reached their cell door. Only after it closed did he finally shake his head with a quiet smile. "I spent 12 years in this place," he admitted. "I thought respect came from making people afraid. Today you proved I was wrong." Elijah carefully placed his gloves on the metal shelf before looking through the narrow window toward the fading evening sky. "Fear can control behavior," he replied softly. "But only character earns lasting respect." Across the housing unit, Derek Cole sat unusually quiet at his usual table. His friends waited for him to make another joke about the elderly inmate, but none came. For the first time in years, confidence had been replaced by uncertainty. He had expected weakness and discovered discipline. He had searched for fear and found compassion. Most confusing of all, the old man had gained admiration without asking for it. Officer Daniel Harris finished his shift by placing Elijah's transfer file back inside the records cabinet. Before locking the drawer, he paused one final time on the highlighted line describing 3 state karate championships, years of teaching young students, and the instructor's personal philosophy written beneath every certification. True strength exists to protect, never to dominate. Harris slowly smiled as he realized those words were not simply part of Elijah's history. They guided every decision he continued to make inside Riverside State Prison. During evening count, inmates stood quietly beside their bunks while correctional officers completed the final inspection of the day. As Officer Harris passed Elijah's cell, their eyes met for only a brief moment. Harris offered a small, respectful nod. Elijah returned the gesture with the same calm smile he had shown since arriving. No words were necessary. Respect had already been exchanged. Later that night, after the lights dimmed across Block D, Marcus noticed Elijah sitting peacefully on the edge of his bunk, gently turning the faded bracelet around his wrist. Strength begins with patience, Marcus read aloud before asking one final question. Do you think people can really change? Elijah looked toward the darkened hallway where countless lives carried burdens no one else could fully understand. Every sunrise gives people another chance, he answered. The difficult part is deciding to become someone better before the next sunset. As silence settled over the prison, a transport bus quietly rolled through the front security gate carrying several newly transferred inmates from another facility. One name on the arrival roster immediately caught the warden's attention, and he slowly closed the folder with a thoughtful expression. Somewhere inside Riverside, another man with an extraordinary past was about to enter Block D. And this time, even the staff wondered what would happen when 2 quiet legends finally crossed paths.